Hi there, my name is Sonia. I'm one of the editors for the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Family Therapy. The editor-in-chief, Glenn Lana, and myself and the rest of the editorial crew would like to welcome you to this very first video in the new initiative of video conversations with people from the family therapy fields, contributors to the journal, editors, writers, practitioners, researchers, and family therapists at large. So before we do jump into the video we've prepared for you today, I'd just like to make a quick note about the rough around the edges nature of this production. In true family therapy style, there are technical glitches, there's nothing perfect, but as we know, it is the conversation that really counts. We hope and will endeavour to produce better videos so that you can enjoy conversations with fellow family therapists. I'd like to introduce today's video. It is the conversation with Pam Rycroft, Michael Hoyt and Jeff Young regarding single session family therapy.
We're here today to discuss volume 41 of the Australian New Zealand Journal of Family Therapy. This is issue 3. It's a very special issue because we invited yourself, Pam, Michael and Jeff to edit collectively this issue, which is called Expanding Applications of Single Session Thinking and Practice. For those people who will be viewing this who may not know what the Australian New Zealand Journal of Family Therapy looks like, because we're now completely digital, this is what a printed copy looks like. So this is, of course, it's available digitally through Wiley. So what I'd like to do is invite each of my fellow collaborators in this conversation to introduce themselves.
Lovely. Thanks, Sonia. Introduce myself. I've been around Bouverie for a very long time now, for 30 years, which says quite a lot about Bouverie, in various roles. And I'm more or less retired at the moment, but still very connected with Bouverie, and mostly through single session interest and work. Prior to Bouverie, in those, in a time long past, I trained as a psychologist until I watched a family therapy session that Amaral Perles held, and I was sold. So I've identified as a family therapist ever since, and worked for a little while in a major psychiatric hospital, and then a community psychiatry, as well as things like ambulance crisis line and a bit of private practice. That's me.
Lovely. Thanks, Pam. And Michael.
I'm Michael Hoyt. I'm also semi-retired, and I came to this single session business in 2 different ways. In the mid-late 1980s, 30 years ago, I was working in a clinic near San Francisco, and Moshe Talmud and Bob Rosenbaum were there, and we were all talking and had the idea to do a project on one session or single session therapy. I think it was Moshe's initial idea, and got Bob involved, and then they came to me. And at that time, I had published 2 or 3 journal articles. So we decided to list my name as to apply for a grant, because maybe they would, because I published something. But the 3 of us worked on this project and wound up giving some papers, and Moshe wrote the book, and we contributed, and then some others. But my other interest in it, and I wrote about this in the chapter that I have in the new book that's going to come out, is my family that was one of the early family therapy families. And we had a single session therapy back when I was 15 years old or 14. And we were having some problems, some issues. I remember it quite well. And went to one meeting, and I knew it would be one meeting, and we all said our piece. Mom, dad, I had an older brother and myself. And then one of the things that the therapist said changed everything. At least got me to think differently. So by the time, and then I had had some teachers along the way who were very powerful and good teachers. And so by the time Bob and Moshe said to me, want to do a project on one session therapy, I was primed. I was ready. I was also interested in Zen and Sufi and Hasidic, so teaching tales and enlightenment and making a shift and all of that sort of thing. So it just sort of fits, the one session at a time, that kind of idea. So that's how I came to be here.
Wow, beautiful. Thank you, Michael. And Jeff.
I'm Jeff Young. I'm the director of the Bouverie Centre and professor of family therapy and systemic practice at La Trobe University. And I've been lucky to be the director of Bouverie as we transition into a fully integrated practice research centre as a research centre within La Trobe University. And the single session thinking, I was part of an initial specialist interest group and clinical practice group, we call them now, at Bouverie, with Pam and the previous director, Colin Rees, and myself, and with a student, Pat Boyan, who did the first research of our single session clients, I think the first 50 sessions in the mid-90s.
Now we're in December 2020. How do we enter a conversation that has a rich history while yet, giving energy for this new turn or this new expansion of the ideas? What do you think about? What do you all think about that?
Well, one way of thinking, we've all got different histories and of coming to single session, and there's also a lot of people out, across the world that have had different histories to it. But I think one way of thinking about it is that the Bouverie Centre created the first international single session and walk-in services conference back in 2012. And then 3 or 4 years later, there was another one in Banff. And then late last year, there was a third in Melbourne again. And there, one of the advantages of an international conference is to reflect on where the field is at and what changed between those years. And so that's one way of thinking about what the developments are and where we're at. And this particular edition of the journal, by the way, it's colloquially called the yellow, and very fondly called the yellow rag.
The yellow rag.
The yellow rag, because of its colour, is that in 2012, Pam and I guest edited a special issue on single session thinking, and then it was fantastic to have Michael join us in 2020. So that's an 8-year period that's been a time to reflect on the developments and change. Pam or Michael?
Thinking about developments over time and the kind of wine out, it makes me remember conversations with Jeff about our training, our single session training at Bouverie. When we started, we were really defensive and worried about people's attitudes towards this one session, including, and maybe particularly referrers, who'd gone to a lot of trouble to refer a client and then heard that we were doing a single session. So whilst we chose to hang on to the term, you know, we were kind of very much wanting to sell, well, not sell it, but convince people about what it really meant and the philosophy behind it and the research behind it. And that has changed so much. But so many times Jeff and I kept thinking, as can happen with new ideas, you know, it's going to have its time and then it will recede. But this training has, I think, almost consistently, maybe there've been a few, you know, ups and downs, but almost consistently been in demand. And that says something pretty strongly. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it just made me reflect on that kind of, it's been one of the trainings that we offer that has been most consistently in demand. Not sure what that says exactly. I have some ideas. But,
about what that might say about the engagement with clients over one session rather than planning out for several sessions might be appealing to therapists who might be interested in the training.
Yeah, and I think it offers a kind of marriage between a really practical, efficient, effective service with a beautiful philosophy that appeals to a lot of people about really collaborating with our clients, really sharing the decisions with them about what we talk about, how much therapy they need, who comes along, all of those decisions. Yeah.
I think that's one of the powerful things about it, is that the therapy world has moved towards a more responsive, transparent, client-led, ethical practice. And what single session thinking does, and single session therapy before that term, provides the practical strategies, skills and approaches to be able to enact those philosophies, make that reality or rhetoric a reality. Because, and I think I agree with Pam that the demand is growing, as reflected in the last description or title of the third conference, which was, you know, single session thinking, you know, going one step at a time. So it's although it feels like it's been very popular in Australia, it's still very new in terms of around the world. There's lots of countries where, you know, they're just using single session thinking as starting to have an early impact.
Sorry. Okay. I was saying to Sonia just before Jeff and Pam joined us that writing this review article for the yellow, whatever we're calling it, the journal, was a sort of a sentimental journey for me. I was quoting Michael Hoyt, who talked about saying hello again and remembering, and I remember when that came in, and I remember talking about that, and that sort of thing. Way back in the late 1980s, when Moshe and Bob and I got involved in some of this, who knew that from little acorns, big oaks would grow? And as I was reading the last issue, the one that we all co-edited of the journal, Moshe, Bob, and I were in a suburb of San Francisco in a middle-class, working-class neighborhood at a medical center. And now I'm reading about single session therapy in Tasmania and single session therapy in Melbourne, Australia, and single session therapy in San Antonio, Texas. And I'm talking with people in Calgary, Canada, and Flavio Canistra and his group did a study about how it's being accepted in Italy. And never had this idea that, I mean, we didn't think that far ahead. This is an interesting thing. We noticed some people came one time. Let's make the most of that. Who are they? Thinking about our meeting today, I was thinking about this, and I found this quotation from Michael Hoyt I wanted to share, because Michael meant a lot to me. And Michael said, "There is a certain pleasure or joy available to us in the knowledge that we can't know beforehand what we'll be thinking at the end. And the idea that we can't know what new possibilities for action in the world might be available to us at that time. Not that we're at the end, but that there's new possibilities opening. There's cultural possibilities, there's new settings, there's respecting people's autonomy and their ability to make their own goals and set their own pace that we weren't thinking about very much way back when. And so this is sort of, wow, this is like an amazing thing to me. And I certainly agree that we're somewhere at the beginning. There's whole areas we haven't even talked about, working with children, working with psychosis, working with larger groups. In the one session, it's single session does not mean only one session, it means one at a time. It's got a beginning, a middle, and end. Somebody sets a goal, you work on something. At the end, you say, want to do this again, or has this been enough? And being at that conference, I was several times, I was just sort of, the conference in Melbourne last year, I was just sort of stunned. Wow, look at all this going on, and who knew this was going to happen, and who knows what new possibilities in the world, as Michael Hoyt would say.
What are some of the important distinctions in single session family therapy work, do you think, that you'd like to share with people who might be viewing this, who may not have been able to read the issue or attend conferences?
I'll give an answer. My colleague, Pam Rycroft, we were working on the new book, and I always like to have epigraphs, pithy, clever quotations that capture the essence. And at the beginning, the first chapter, it's a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, the famous Lao Tzu from the Chinese 6th century BC. But then for the last chapter, what's our message? And Pam found, and I just think it's wonderful, a quotation: remember then, there is only one time that is important. Now. It is the most important time because it's the only time when we have any power. It's from Leo Tolstoy. You can't do anything about what has happened in the past. The future is a mystery. We someday we'll get there, but it's the now. And it's, again, at that idea of it being an open field, of being creative. And it's difficult for therapists because we know a lot, and sometimes we want to make it go a certain way. We know what they need. And I think we do have special expertise, but so does the client. They have their life, their experience, and putting the two together. So I think the essence of the single session is saying we're going to work with them to help them find their truth, their way, their path. And we're going to use what we know, but we're not going to dominate them. I know I keep quoting Michael Hoyt. I once did an interview with Michael, and he wanted to call it, we did a couple of them, but direction and discovery. And he said, yes, the therapist will do something to set the direction, but the discoveries are to be found by the client and by the therapist. Otherwise, we're just doing more of the same. If you're, my other quotation, that if you already know where you're going to be at the end, why bother? That's it. And so to me, that's really the essence of the single session. This is an encounter, a moment, an adventure, an open field. That's what I think is truly the essence. I mean, there's all the setting goals and all of that, but I think that's detail, just sitting down and saying, what's up? Where are we going? What do you want to do? That's my take. Mm-hmm.
And
it's all because of Pam's quotation from your
Leo's.
After you, Pammy.
Okay. I was thinking, as Michael was talking, I was also thinking of Michael Hoyt, because he was he inspired me when people we were training asked, well, what do you actually do in a single session? What is it that's different? What skills do we need to develop? What's different? And we would always say, well, no, you start from your own strengths. It's not particular different skills, your own model, your own strengths, your own style. But there was a demand to kind of look at, well, how do we make the most of each session? How do we do that? How are we fully present? And I always remember Michael as being the one who, I don't know whether other people have done it, whether he's the only one, but he was the first one who actually mapped what he's trying to do in any particular session. I thought that was just brilliant. It was a wonderful way to get an insight into, the therapist's brain and where that direction that Michael talked about, where he was trying to head. So that became the inspiration for our setting out a kind of map of what happens in a single session. But it's not about a model or a style. And, when I think about the essence, I think it's something Jeff and I have been trying to grapple with. What are the essential kind of elements that make it a single session? Because it's not a particular model. And I was just rereading a beautiful letter at the end of Moshe Talman's second book, which is a book written for clients. That's the better version. And it just reminded me of the philosophy about, that's really about, it's written for clients, and it encourages clients to work towards making the therapist as redundant as quickly as possible, and it's just full of respect and hope and forgiveness. And, bit back to what Jeff said earlier about it's a really kind of ethical, respectful kind of attitude to go in with. Yeah. And I was also, I'll stop in a minute. I think Jeff might talk about this more, but there's an exercise we do in our training where we actually get people to imagine the difference, an imaginative, exercise, preparing for the first of what they assume will be ongoing sessions, but then preparing for one where they know there will only be this session. Jeff, do you want to talk a bit about that? Because I think that's a beautiful way to talk about the distinction.
Yeah, well, in some ways, that exercise just helps people think what single session means to their personality and to their model of practice. And it's essentially creating a forced context where they have to approach that first session as if it's the last, by saying that the client that they're about to see is going to go into state or move countries the day after their appointment. But to still go through that same appointment knowing it'll be the last. And it actually changes people's approach to the work to be very, to engage all these high ideals that we've been talking, that Pam and Michael have been talking about, of asking just what people want to walk away with by the end of the session. And are you on track to make sure that they get what they want? And being very open and transparent about sharing your thoughts as if you're never going to see the person again. So all of a sudden, through that practice, no matter what model you come from, no matter what personality and whether you're active or not so active in the therapy, you are becoming collaborative with the client-led. You're sharing, and you're very transparent, sharing what your thoughts are in a tentative but direct way. And that then leads to what seems to be really quite effective therapy that clients really love. And eventually, once you get your head around it as a clinician, you also enjoy the collaboration, and so that it becomes you through the process, you empower the client to take an active role, and including not assuming. And what I love about it is that once you realise that a lot of clients find that that's sufficient, not just through following up and seeing whether they want more work or not, and realising that you can't predict who's going to come for more sessions and who's going to be fine. it actually creates a sense of humbleness in the therapist, that you can't predict those things, so that you have to have a sort of a non-attachment to outcome. Because one of the powerful things you find when you ring up after and check how the session's gone, one, you can feel like you've had a really crappy session, the client has changed dramatically and found it really helpful. The reverse, unfortunately, is true. You can think you had a great session and nothing changes. You can ring up someone who had a really complex problem and their things seem to have remarkably changed, not at least sparked by that session. And equally, you can have someone who didn't present with something so complex. You ring up and they want ongoing work. So you have to be sort of detached from thinking that you can predict. And once you accept that you can't predict or necessarily know, it creates this real liberation of flexibility and power in the therapist too, to be able to be more direct and maybe more challenging and more sharing in their knowledge. And so I love how the practical translates into a very ethical, collaborative practice.
Yeah, it's like that metaphor I use. I once wrote a paper called A Golfer's Guide to Brief Therapy. And I said the therapist should remember that we are the caddy, not the player. Our job is to help the player play better, maybe advise them a little bit, hand them one of their clubs, remind them of skills they have, but we don't push them out of the way and take over. Jay Haley would say to clients often at the first session, he'd say, if I told you we were only going to meet one time, what would you want to focus on? Oh, well, in that case, I'd really want to figure out what to do about my daughter, or what to do about my, whatever their problem was. He wouldn't even say we are going, just if. And it was a way of concentrating the mind. Let's get to it. What's up right now that's important to you? Because that's where the person's motivation is, their heart is, their energy is. So I think I'm just, resonating on what you're saying, but I think it's very exciting to see people feel, instead of I'm broken and I'm crazy and I'm dysfunctional and I'm weak and all those negative pathological terms, I can make a difference. I can make a change. Another thing I think is going on right now, if I rattle on just for a minute.
Could I just respond to that, Michael? Because I reckon we, in addition to engaging and drawing on the motivation of the client, responding to what they want really quickly and how they want and what outcomes they want. There's also an inherent element of single session work, which I don't think is talked about that much. Might be a little bit sensitive to say, but it also assumes and encourages the client to take responsibility for change. So for example, you have a session, and if you then have a follow-up phone call, like we do at Bouverie, is that you have a session and you expect that the client is going to put some of those ideas into practice. And you create some space that's supported. So after that session, the client can ring in at any time, they can contact you at any time. So they've got the holding and the support, but you're not automatically making an appointment to think, okay, let's have a session. What's the next step? Well, we'll just make another session because we know you're not going to be able to put this into practice. Actually says, well, you may put it into practice so well that you might not come back, but if you need some more support, then that's fine, that's there too. So it really does build on the motivation of the client. You're sort of the caddy to their great game, but you also assume that they are going to are accountable for trying to put things into practice with the support of yourself if they can't. Sorry, Michael.
Interesting. Yeah.
Interesting.
Sonia, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What about the single session work appeals to you? What's spoken about it?
Well, thank you for the question. I really appreciate it. And I've done quite a lot of thinking and also reflecting about my practice. And when I was reading your book, the book review that Christoph Mikes Lou did, I was really looking at his resonance, his internal resonance and reflection between a single session and how he can affect dialogical practices. And so similar to Christoph, in my mind, I'm thinking in one session, if I were to bring forward particular narrative maps or feminist thinking or questions or some post-structural, deconstruction of a particularly pervasive and persuasive discourse, why I'd be using them, I'd be accountable to those maps, I'd be accountable to those questions. And how could I invite the client to collaborate with me in just one session? It's a question that follows a question.
Yeah, I found sometimes it's helpful to put it in a different vocabulary. We could go this way, or this way. I'm not sure what would be most useful for you, and there may be some other ideas you had. What do you think would be the thing for us to talk about, rather than me deciding we have to explore hierarchies or the unconscious or communication patterns or intergenerational dynamics? Returning it to the client, here's the menu I know. Do any of these appeal to you? And if not, you may have some better ideas.
Right. And that might segue into the question about a distinction between single session thinking and perhaps the practices of single session methods. We had a little bit of a preamble conversation about that. And I conveyed that I was really, if I take in single session thinking to one session, even if I don't know it's going to be one single session and I never see the client again, I'm less likely to be continually worried about if this client is going to come back or not. And I'm more likely to, as Jeff pointed out, really be confident in the idea that the accountability for somebody's life resides with them. Their responsibility to make change resides with them. And I think that is what some of the single session thinking has brought to my practice.
I think this is one of the really exciting elements of this particular issue, because if I go back and think, actually, what's the definition of single session thinking from my point of view is one. It's based on 3 research findings. Like the first one is that a lot of clients come once, whether you like it or not. We used to think of them as failures, but then the second research finding found that the majority of people actually found that really useful. And then the third finding, which is often more of a clinical finding, is that you can't predict who's going to come once and who's going to come back. So that it was based on therapeutic research. And then when we did training over the years, we started to find that a lot of people outside the therapy room found these ideas really helpful. So people in housing, even just case management, so we started talking about it as single session work, so not to be therapeutic centric. And then as things have expanded into very different uses, when we were doing the conference last year, we were trying to think what's an inclusive title with Tess McGrain and Pam and myself, and we started to think around single session thinking, and in a way, it's the power of a concept that's really opened up a whole range of applications of single session work, single session therapy to sort of many more contexts. For example, I was just doing a mentoring session with a colleague, a fellow manager before this session today. and just talking around how to manage the huge demands of COVID with so many emails and so much information. How can you actually do the really important work? And I drew on single session thinking, you know, to sort of say, well, okay, what's the most important thing I should be doing right now? What's the most important thing we want to get out of this executive meeting? We've only got 10 minutes left of this meeting. What's the most important thing that we should be addressing before the end? And so you can't say, let's use single session therapy or single session work. Single session thinking allows you to take those concepts into so many different areas. And I think the update and the editorial that we did together for this journal actually is the first time apart from the conference, that we've articulated the difference between single session thinking and then its application.
I think there's a very dangerous concept in our field that we have to be careful about. And single session runs right into it. And the word is normal. And there's been a very, the gaze and what is normal. And I think there are three mental illnesses. There's psychosis, neurosis, and normosis. When you kind of get normal. And I think it's important now because with the other, let me use the word loosely, liberation movements going on, LGBTQ and all these other things, people are realizing there's many different ways to be healthy, to be normal, to be functional, to be in the world. It's very liberating to people. How can I be a better me instead of having to live to somebody else's standard or somebody else's idea of what I should do? And I think when people get that in the single session, wow, they want to know what I think would be helpful for me instead of they're telling me what's wrong with me. And they're assuming I have some ability, some intelligence, some skill. It's very liberating. It gives people I can solve these problems. I'm not so bad or broken. And if you really want to read an excellent chapter in the yellow, what are we calling it? The yellow journal?
Yellow rag. The Australian New Zealand Journal of Family Therapy.
Yes. I would recommend people take a look at the article by Jeff Young. It's very, very good. And it lays out a lot of the things we're talking about very systematically. I have the table of contents. I printed it. I love all the chapters for different reasons, but I think it really articulates some of the practices. I think Wendy Dryden's chapter articulates a different way of thinking, but he also describes some of the practices. And Wendy has just come out with a new book. Did you get your copy, Jeff? It just arrived. It's the interview. Yes, our interviews, but then he wrote a really excellent at the beginning kind of overview of single session therapy. I was very impressed. He's pulled a lot of it together. But I don't think there is a thing called single session therapy or, one approach or what do you do or what's the protocol or what are the 5 steps or the 3, it's all the different ideas that we've been discussing. Yeah.
Pam, what stood out to you about the practice of editing these articles for the journal? And there are a mix of research papers and practice papers and a theoretical kind of overview, and that's why I really appreciate this particular issue and what you've done with it. Was there anything that stood out to you particularly?
Well, it was exactly that, Sonia, for me. It was the range, because I think, they are so different, those articles, in style, in scope, and in where they come from, which is great. And it was a kind of way to reflect what we're talking about, the increased depth and breadth of the thinking behind the variety of adaptations. So, yeah, I love it. I love I particularly love, I think, even people's different style of writing, and some are you know, are more research oriented and fairly formal. There's that distinct from the Indigenous article that I particularly love for going into some things. I think you said it earlier, Sonia, but covering some things that aren't necessarily particular to single session work, but are really give a beautiful account of how those wonderful folk work, and their discussion about emotion and the therapist, you know, the therapist's own emotion, managing that within a single session is just beautiful. So yeah, it's the range, it's the variety. It's I'd want everybody to read every one, because it's not one to select one out from. It's actually in the collection that I think is the good thing about this edition.
I was thinking of all of the different papers, and there's so much in each one, but for me, if I go through, I think the update was great to write with Michael, and Michael took the lead, and Pam, just to see where we're at now. And then my article looked at family therapy informed by single session thinking, which was sort of core to the journal. But I did love Alison Elliott and James Dacona, interviewed by Henry von Duser. And Alison is in the Indigenous team at Bouverie and is Aboriginal, and James is Papua New Guinean. And they actually described single session as a decolonising tool. And that's a new area, and along with some work that's starting to emerge in single session approaches to trauma work, is that the philosophy that we've talked about, it's actually very empowering to marginalised communities and traumatised communities, because you're asking what they want, and you're client-led rather than imposing, as Michael had said earlier. So that's a new area of development. And then looking at, I love Jason Westwater's and his team's description, which was sort of more research, showing what we're finding in lots of CAMS environments, where family therapy using single session frames getting really good results, that's providing really efficient, effective and cost-effective services. And then Flavio Canistras and his team showed that, one, it worked in Italy. It was one of the first papers to research single session thinking in Italy, but also that it worked in private and public. And that hadn't really been done before. Wendy's paper showed that single session thinking is relevant for CBT, not just family therapy. And in fact, which is a metaphor that single session thinking is relevant and changes and can inform any model of therapy. So together, I think it's a lovely, there's a lot in this issue.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, I was similarly struck by that, bringing forward a linking single session work with decolonisation and decolonising, and inviting particularly that line in that paper by Elliott and Dacona about you can't ask or somebody to do something where they already have a history of being disempowered over generations, or something to that effect. That's not an exact quote, but and then inviting a decolonisation process to happen through just one session was quite remarkable to me. Yeah.
We had an interesting experience as editors, particularly with that paper, because we did not want to colonize their decolonizing approach. We didn't want to edit them and tell them how it should be expressed. And part of the idea was it would be better in the oral tradition as an interview and written, rather than a more typical with a literature review and a hypothesis and all of that. of all the papers, if I was going to read one, I don't know which one I'd read. I really don't. The one that touched me the most by far was the Indigenous paper. That's the one that my heart opened and I gasped and I felt like I was reading poetry and it moved me personally and something opened up. All of them are really good. So I don't want to just say read that. Each one is just it's a symphony. Oh, I want to hear the flute, and I want to hear the drum, and I want to hear together. The whole is much greater than the sum of the parts, and it gives the message. There's lots of different ways to look at this, and but the whole thing.
Thank you, Michael, and that just speaks volumes about your consideration around the editing process and how to pull these papers together, like the three of you together. It speaks volumes to me about, when an issue comes out, it really does speak volumes about the consideration and care and thought that goes into how to present this work, how to present the work that we do as therapists, how to present a method or a model or a way of thinking, and then how to present, perhaps introduce some of the research about it.
Well, the medium is the message or parallel process. And in some ways, as Pam was saying, they're written in different styles or with different voices. And I thought with each one, our job is to say, louder, louder, could you make that clearer rather than make them do it differently? And so everyone's not exactly the same. It's not the normal approach, but it made it much richer. And more interesting. And several of I have a personal commitment because I've been writing and editing for a long time, and I'm in my generative phase of trying to help younger therapists and writers and this. And several people wrote emails back to us. This has been a wonderful experience, or thank you. Or when I submitted a paper to another journal, they beat me up and told me how bad I was. And this is such a different experience. And I think it's the parallel. It brings, they were coming forward the same way when they see the therapist is warm and receptive and open, the client can come forward rather than being colonized or pathologized. And and there was still, we can help you with your grammar and your spelling and ask you to, explain something a little bit more. Could you elaborate? That kind of idea. But it's a very different way of being rather than there's a right way and we're going to force you into it.
I think the Australian New Zealand Journal of Family Therapy have had a very nice history of collaborating the editors and now the previous editors, but also now with Glenn, of really supporting and helping people get their papers published rather than, unhelpful, critical, sometimes almost verging on abusive editorial. And I think Michael, Pam and I have been co-editing the book from the most of the chapters coming out of the international conference last year. And so we've established a lovely working relationship, and hopefully that comes through in the edition too. I think we've got very different skills and different approaches and different styles, but I think there's an ethic that unites us that's really been quite special.
Yeah, I agree. It's been a pleasure working with my colleagues and friends, and we've had humor and we've had moments we scratched our heads and weren't sure what to do, and we jokes, and I keep blaming my dog for things and saying, she told me, I don't know about this, but my dog says we should do this. And
he has a very wise dog, I should tell you.
Very wise. She gets royalties too.
Right.
Mostly in bones.